Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about wildlife in a world that is dominated by human beings. And how does wildlife fit into that world, and what may be the future of it, and what is our responsibility to it? My guest for this conversation is Emma Marris. Emma Marris is an award-winning environmental and science journalist whose writings have appeared in many publications. Her latest book is called Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. She joins me via Zoom. Emma Marris, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
I'll let you in on a little secret, along with, I guess, all of our listeners, of how I have been getting through this pandemic. And basically, it's been with edibles and David Attenborough nature films. And I'm not lying on that. I actually got one of those Facebook posts saying, here's what you posted last year. And I actually posted that a year ago on Facebook. And what I found out in preparing for our conversation, actually, is I'm not alone in that.
No, I think it's a common coping strategy to try to get a sense of escape, even though we're all cooped up at home.
Yeah. It also speaks to the popularity during this pandemic, but even before, of nature films. And you've sort of taken on nature films and question if they're actually showing us the reality of how nature really is.
Yeah, now I too love a good David Attenborough documentary, so don't get me wrong. I find them to be incredibly soothing, incredibly fun. I learned a ton. I did in this piece for The Atlantic take a little bit of issue with how they frame the scenes that they present to the viewer. They just almost ruthlessly edit out any kind of hint of the human world. So even though often they're filming not too far from a road, or perhaps there's a fence around, or maybe there's even a biology station just off the screen, they always leave that stuff off camera. So they do kind of tend to give us this sense that there is this unhuman world, this completely wild world out there that's just a place we haven't happened to visit, but a place that exists, that's completely pristine. And I think that can be kind of a harmful myth, because I think it affects people how people view nature, and also how willing they are to kind of make friends with and enjoy the nature that is more touched by humanity, that's maybe in the city or in the suburbs.
Tell me more about that myth. Is it just getting this idea that there's all these places that haven't been touched by humans?
So the sort of myth of pristine wilderness is something that I think conservation, environmentalism have been reckoning with for the last couple of decades. And it's a theme that weaves through a lot of my work. I think we're just learning a lot more, or at least white people are learning a lot more about how indigenous people manage their landscapes for many thousands of years before colonization. So this sort of old-fashioned idea that when white people stepped off the boat, they were looking at a virgin wilderness is something that I think the field of conservation biology has pretty firmly rejected at this point, which is great. But I think there's a lot of hangovers from that idea that are still woven into our policies about how we take care of and protect lands, and also just in our own ideas about what counts as nature, what doesn't count as nature. I think this kind of notion that things are just better the less they've been influenced by humans is actually a harmful one that's been woven pretty deeply into conservation.
There's this tendency to think of nature as being without humans.
Right. And there's this tendency to think that if humans touch nature at all, it's always a negative outcome, which I think really limits our imaginations in terms of figuring out how we can have good relationships with other species, how we can set up an interwoven existence with other species, with plants and animals, where we can all flourish together. We tend to revert back to this notion that the only way to protect nature is to withdraw from it, because humans are inherently tainting or polluting. And there's limits. I mean, I am very much in support of parks and protected areas, but there are limits to the sort of withdrawal approach to saving things. There are cases where we need to engage, where we need to help plants and animals, or where we need to welcome plants and animals into our spaces, into our cities and our lives. So I just want us to be able to access and be able to conceptualize all the different tools that are available to us. And I think that's harder to do if we stick with a strict humans are bad, humans are not part of nature dichotomy. So I think that's why I push back on that so frequently.
This will be a big question, so feel free to go with it wherever you like. But how would you describe the state of wildlife today?
Yeah, so I mean, I just wrote a book. Wild Souls is about wild animals in particular, and one of the most sort of sobering facts about wild animals is their abundances are quite low compared to the past. So, we may still have elephants and tigers, but there are just far fewer of them than there were, 5, 6 generations ago. And that's, I think, the thing that I think many people have understood that there are declines in animal species, but I think it's always important to to know whether you're talking about like whether the species is extinct or whether it's declined in abundance. And they're both bad. But the good news about abundance declines is that they're reversible. You can make more tigers and elephants as long as you have some to start with. So I think I do focus on abundance issues in the book quite a bit, and also in figuring out ways where we can just fit more wildlife onto the planet. But yeah, most species on Earth now are live. I mean, most animals by weight or mammals by weight are livestock. So one way to think about sort of solving our challenges with living well with the rest of the species is to figure out how to flip that. How can most of the animals on the planet be wild and fewer of them, or none of them, maybe someday, be livestock? I don't know about none. I don't know if we'll ever get to none, but I think we could get to very low levels.
It seems to me that we're living in a world in which it's harder for large wild animals to exist, like elephants, like bears, like you name it. Is it reasonable to think that they'll be able to survive in the future?
Yes, I'm a very optimistic person. So, I mean, there's definitely challenges. The challenges are mostly human behavioral challenges. They're about politics. They're about how humans act, and all of that can be worked on. Those are solvable issues. With the people have the will, we can make it happen. And extinctions are. I will say extinctions are irreversible, even if you bring them back with the magic of genetic engineering. There's been a break in continuity there, and a lot of the sort of ecological roles that they played have been lost. But I think that for animals that exist now, it's not as if we don't have the technology or we don't know how to do it. We know how to do it. So it's just a matter of political will.
Do you look at population at all? Global population?
Oh, yes. It's a common question, and I think it's a reasonable one to ask. But I would say that, first of all, the question of human population has had a very dark history inside of conservation. For a lot of the run of Western conservation, talk about population was often used to sort of say, these brown people need to stop having so many children, or they need to stop coming to our country. So there was a lot of anti-immigrant, a lot of racist dialogue around population, and I think that really has left a very upsetting legacy in the field, one that we still need to completely reckon with. So that said, there are a lot of humans. The main thing I think that we need to focus on is reducing the impact of high impacting humans, like you and I, people who live lifestyles with a lot of carbon, a lot of land, a lot of water flowing towards us. How can we change those systems so that everybody on the planet can live fulfilling, exciting, fun lives, but the environmental impact of those lives is much less. So that's the main thing. And I'll say also that the research shows pretty well that if you make people's lives more fulfilling, if you give them opportunities for education, they tend to have fewer children. So the main focus, I think, should be on the size of the impact of each person, and making sure that we have justice on this planet, that everybody has clean water, that everyone has access to electricity, that everyone has access to education. And I think if we do those things, we will see demographically a natural plateau.
It's interesting when we think about what nature is and what it isn't. And I said at the very beginning, I was going to say I was joking. I was kind of joking, but I was also being very serious about the edibles and David Attenborough films. But the third thing that has really helped get me through this pandemic is suddenly taking long walks around a lake that I live near in downtown Oakland, Lake Merritt, which is in downtown Oakland. It is as urban as an environment as you could possibly imagine. But at the same time, the lake is connected to the San Francisco Bay. It's a saltwater lake, and it's very wild. The aquatic life you get in it, the plant life you get, the aquatic plant life you get in it, and then the birds that come by. So it's something really amazing to see. And maybe not everyone has a lake like that in their city, but it does sort of, it has made me think differently about what nature is, where you could find nature, and even the role of, when we think of wildlife, we think of preserved areas, but we also get wildlife in urban areas, in cities. Talk to me about wildlife in urban areas and cities.
So this is a particular love of mine, and I think part of the reason is I grew up, in the city of Seattle, and I did go camping with my family, but I also spent most of my childhood in a very urban environment. But I was able to find a lot of non-human adventure in that space, in terms of interacting with birds and trees and learning the names of species. My mother always taught me the name of plants, and I think that almost more so than my infrequent activities in, say, a national park, are what formed my connection with nature. So if you really care about the future of the non-human world, then I think you should care about making sure that the new generation coming up has that connection. And I actually think it's much more effective and much more joy providing to sort of form that connection where they're at. And not to say you have to wait 6 months for summer vacation and then get in the car and drive for 12 hours. And then you'll get to Yellowstone and this will be nature and you will get to experience it for 3 days and then you will go home and that will be it. I don't think that creates a long lasting bond. So I think that kind of reframing what counts as nature and then encountering it and really loving it in the urban sphere is what is really going to create the next generation of conservation leaders. And I found this to be true already, that if you ask people who actively for their careers are involved in trying to save species, and you ask them about childhood nature experiences, sometimes you'll get very exciting stories about seeing whales breach in Puget Sound or something. But more often you hear about fort building in out behind the cul-de-sac where they grew up, or trying to catch frogs in a little urban creek that was, next to the gas station. That's really what does form these experiences for people. And I also just think that we forget about this, but it provides daily happiness to so many. If you just walk down the street and you just see tree, bird, you don't have that relationship. But once you say, oh, here's an oak tree, and oh, look, this oak tree has little galls on it, and oh, look, there's a robin, and oh boy, I haven't seen so many robins recently. It's March, maybe they're coming through. Just having that understanding that you're living in an ecosystem and beginning to learn a little bit about it can be just joyful on a daily basis. And we could all use that right now.
It deepens one's experience in daily life to see that in your own neighborhood. For me, this is where birds are really important. Yeah. I think for people living in cities, it's one of the last remaining non-human life forms that you have some kind of a daily interaction with.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of insects around. People don't bond with them quite as readily, although there's some people who do, and you can get really into that. And certainly there's skunks and coyotes and so on that live in many cities, but they can be harder to see on a daily basis. You're right that birds they're big, they're colorful, they're easy to see every single day. And I think that, people who get into birding can sometimes forget that a house sparrow or a robin or whatever the local crow, whatever the local city species are, that, just because they're common doesn't mean they're not also gorgeous and miraculous. Just watching the iridescent feathers of the grackle that's hopping around, trying to eat the French fries in the street can really transport you and make you realize that there's so much beauty right there.
And pigeons, we oftentimes refer to them as rats with wings, but they're actually a really special bird, especially when it comes to navigation and things.
Oh, they're geniuses. I recommend Nathaniel Johnson's book. I think it's called, I don't have natural. Anyway, he wrote a book about urban nature, and he did ginkgo biloba. He did squirrels, and he did pigeons, and it's a great read. Nathaniel Johnson from Grist, and his pigeon chapter is filled with tidbits that are just fascinating.
Do you think there's more wildlife in cities than people realize?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it is that the wildlife is smart, and so it knows how to avoid interactions that it doesn't want to get involved with. So there's a lot of nocturnal activity that we don't see. One thing that's been really interesting for me is the rise of game cams or trail cams as a way to kind of see more about our own environments. I've been using them to sort of check out the squirrel. I mean, pardon me. I've been using them to check out the skunks that live in my backyard. And it's been a lot of fun to see mama skunk and baby skunks come out and play and eat and drink and, do all their stuff. They do it all after we have withdrawn for the evening. And so there's a bit of a timeshare dynamic going on for sure.
That's interesting. Do you think there's more wildlife activity in cities at night than during the day?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have I can't name you a study right now, but I'd be shocked if that wasn't true. It's true too that I think studies have shown that even species that weren't nocturnal can sometimes become nocturnal when they're living in a more urban environment because they're clever enough to sort of shift their patterns of activity around so that they'll be able to do what they need to do without too much getting too bothered or controlled.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with award-winning environmental and science journalist Emma Marris. Emma Marris is the author of the book Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. In 2013, she also published the book Rambunctious, Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. Emma Marris, can we make, and are there efforts, do you know, to try to, focusing on cities here, to make them more habitable for wildlife?
I think we're still I think we're at a hinge point with that, right? Because, until quite recently, it was always the goal of every municipality to remove all wildlife from its borders, if possible, basically, except with the possible exception of songbirds, which have long had a special relationship with humans where we feed them and we like them. And certainly, I think that when coyotes and other species that have more of a predatory habit they're still very much considered to be something that isn't compatible with urban life. But I think that's beginning to change just slightly in some areas. There's a sense that actually maybe we can coexist with even predators like a coyote in an urban space without having to control them or just killing them on instinct. So I think it's at very early days yet. So I think we're kind of more in the phase of reconsidering the killing. We're not quite at the how do we design cities to make them more better habitat for other species. But I think that's coming, right? So we already have wildlife overpasses over major highways. Those are usually outside of the city. But you're beginning, I just heard, there's a coastal city on the West Coast that has this small wildlife overpass for sea otters that's basically in the city. So I think you're going to be able to start seeing a little bit more of that, those conscious attempts to make the city a place where more species can live together.
That would be a good thing, you would think.
Oh, I think so. I mean, there's always trade-offs, right? I mean, there are some species that can carry diseases that affect humans. And we all know that is something that we need to take really seriously. For example, in a lot of places, people do worry a lot about tick-borne illness, and those can be correlated with the presence of deer mice. And so if you make your city extremely great habitat for deer mice, that could be problematic. So you do need to sort of balance everyone's desire to have a kind of a green, thriving city that doesn't feel sterile and that doesn't feel like just the sun baking down on concrete, with also being able to keep people safe. You see similar conversations with plants and how we all kind of want our parks and to be rich with plants. But if they get too sort of bushy, then there can be problems with the people feeling safe. So there's a lot of trade-offs there. And I think it's a really fascinating area.
Interesting. Talk to me about animals, wild animals, and how we see animals. Oftentimes when we see animals, we think of them as just beings that act instinctually, not necessarily as aware of themselves as an individual. Tell me about that notion and what you would say about that.
So I think this is another cultural transformation that we're in the midst of. And I think it's a really exciting one, which is to really sort of think about animals as individuals with agency, rather than thinking of them primarily as just instinct-driven units of a population. So certainly as a conservation reporter, somebody who's focused on, preventing extinctions for many years, I primarily thought about individual animals as how many of them are there, and is it enough to keep a thriving population going? And what about their behavior is going to be, something that is going to, like, for example, if they are getting run over by cars a lot, how can we deal with that? But I think, in one way, I think the environmental humanities are really to be thanked here for this shift in perspective. There was a movement, starting some years ago of animal history that took a look at sort of historical developments from the point of view of not just how did animals affect this, but how did individual animals and their own choices affect the course of history, which I think is so fascinating. And so, for example, I wrote a piece that I consider to be a little bit of like an animal history, which was about an individual wolf in Oregon and how its decisions about where to go and what to eat and who to mate with and where to live affected wolf policy statewide and kind of helped shape the wolf plan that we're now still using to manage our population of wolves here in the state. So I think that's been a real shift and a really fascinating one. Most animals like a wolf or a great ape or an elephant, they aren't just robots with input and output, and you can't necessarily predict their behavior. They do have personality differences between them. They are making active choices about what to do and how to act in certain situations. And they can be agents in history. And I think realizing that is really quite profound. I think it's changed the way I think about the non-human world deeply.
What do you think about animals having individual consciousness and what do we know about that? There have been studies trying to look into that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the more we study consciousness in animals, the bigger the circle gets in terms of who, what kind of species are conscious. In fact, in the book, I even talk about some initial preliminary work that's been done on insect consciousness. There's been work done on fish consciousness. I think that we have been very reluctant to realize that we are actually surrounded by individuals with a sense of self and with the ability to make choices in the world. But I think that actually a lot more types of animals have those kind of core selfhood than we probably grew up thinking.
Yeah. Talk to me about then tell me about the dangers of conservation, how we've practiced conservation, and the dangers in how we may protect one species, say, over another.
So this is a tension that's really core to the book Wild Souls, and that kind of prompted me to write it, which is that I realized that, so if you look at worldwide threatened animals in particular, a lot of them live on islands. And that's true for a lot of ecological reasons. Their populations are just smaller to begin with, but it's also true because of this dynamic of non-native predators being introduced to islands and then making very short work of the species that are there. This is a very common dynamic on islands around the world. And when I say islands, I mean up to and including the island of Australia. So also quite big places like New Zealand and Australia. When cats and rats and stoats and mice have been introduced to islands, they're often just much more successful predators than whatever the local animals were dealing with before. And the local animals are not prepared to sort of cope with this new predator. So it's a really common conservation approach to kill these introduced predators in large numbers. And as I was reporting on some of these efforts to eradicate mice or rats or foxes or cats from certain islands, or goats sometimes are a target, there's actually tons of species that have been eradicated by conservationists. I realized that there's a lot of killing involved in saving species. And that philosophically, this is a complex ethical equation, because on the one hand, you have the species, you're saving the whole species, you're trying to prevent an extinction. And on the other hand, you have the lives of the individual animals that you're killing to achieve that objective. So it's individuals versus species at some sort of overgeneralized simplistic level. And I found that to be really ethically challenging because you can't measure those against each other. They're in a different currency, so to speak. One is about individual sentient beings, and one is about this abstract category of a species. So I found it really ethically challenging to try to figure out if there were any limits to whether, is there some sort of number of cats that is too many to kill to save a species? Or could you kill 10 million cats to save a species? Would that still be ethically acceptable? And that's what really launched me down the road of writing Wild Souls, is I wanted to figure that out.
And you dived into a lot of philosophy around this issue.
Yes, right. So I broadened the scope a little bit. So there's chapters about zoos. There's chapters about There's a chapter about hunting. There's a chapter about conservation breeding, where all the, like with the California condor, where all the wild animals are taken out of the wild to save their own kind. And then I have like 3 chapters about conservation killing. It sounds like a lot of downer death stuff, but there's a lot of different interesting approaches that people are thinking about to try to get out of this endless cycle of killing. So I talk a lot about some of those hopeful approaches as well. But yeah, I did a lot of philosophy for this, which, was new for me. I consider myself a science writer. But in some ways, analytic philosophy is very sciencey, because it's all about starting with premises and going to conclusions. It's very logical. There's kind of a scientific, so especially if you are kind of looking at one of those sort of more classic schools like Peter Singer's utilitarian view of animals as beings that can suffer and trying to prevent as much suffering as possible. Or if you look at Tom Reagan's view of animal rights, then you can kind of supply those rules to these different situations. Some of the other philosophical approaches that I talk about in the book are less rule-based and a little more holistic, and are kind of also include things like, what is the relationship between the person making the decision and the animals in question? And how do we feel about these different outcomes? So it was such a fascinating journey learning about all these different philosophical ways to look at this problem.
There are efforts to try to give individual animals, legal protections.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's a really interesting way to, this is more along with the sort of animal rights approach, which is, instead of saying, well, they should suffer, so we should be nice to them, it's saying, no, actually, they have a right to life or liberty or autonomy or these different things. And that right should be legally protected. So the Non-Human Animals Project is a group of lawyers who've been trying to sue on behalf of mostly elephants and great apes that are in bad captivity situations. They're alone or their conditions aren't good. And they're trying to sue on the basis that it's just should be illegal to keep them captive without their will, without their consent.
How do we know about consent then? And maybe this gets us into zoos, which you write about.
So, I think a real breakthrough for me in trying to puzzle through all this was, we talked earlier about how wildness or wilderness is a concept that can be harmful, because it kind of posits that these places or these animals were completely untouched by humans in the past. But I began to think about wildness in terms of animals. And I realized that there's another way you could kind of cash that out, or another way you can conceptualize it, which is just, does the animal have freedom, or is this individual animal being controlled by humans? So in that way, a tiger in a cage would not be wild, but a tiger in the forest would. My kind of rough and ready definition is, if the animal decides what it's going to have for breakfast, then it's a wild animal. I don't know if everyone's going to agree with that definition. It's an interesting way to start a debate, but it did get me thinking a lot about whether animals care about having freedom or care about having autonomy. And I think that there's evidence to show that some of them at least do. They would rather not be locked up in a zoo. They would rather have more freedom to pursue their own interests, to go where they want to go.
Tell me about some of that evidence.
Well, some of it comes from wild animal pets, which often try valiantly to escape because they have an inborn urge to disperse and start their own pack or find a mate. And they're finding that urge thwarted. And so wolves and wolf dogs that are hybrids that are kept as pets are notorious for escaping. And then I talk about escape attempts in zoos, and there's a lot of great examples that were all gathered up by a guy named Jason Hyball in a book called Fear of the Animal Planet, which just has dozens and dozens and dozens of accounts of animals trying and using all of their cognitive abilities, their impressive cognitive abilities, to get out of the zoo, even though, they got 3 square meals a day and they were being well taken care of, they were getting their health checkups, they would prefer not to be there. It's pretty clear to me. So I do think that at least some animals actually value autonomy. although it's difficult to say. We can't just ask them.
Right.
But I do think that for many animals, having the freedom to make their own choices is something that we should try to protect. We might not always be able to protect it. With the California condor, we had to take away the autonomy of the individual condors in order to save them. They would have all died of lead poisoning if we had not captured them and put them in the. So there was a sense in which we were acting like in loco parentis. There, we were stepping in and saying, "This is for the greater good. This is going to help you. We're going to take away your freedom for a while." I think that was justifiable, but I don't know if putting animals on display in the zoo for us to just watch and enjoy, have a good fun day out. Yeah, I don't know if that's justifiable. I argue in the book that it is not.
And it's also, I guess, worth asking, is it justifiable? And I think this is what you're getting at, of trying to return the world to a pre-colonial moment as though it was frozen in time. And if that still works.
Yeah. And I think that that's going to be really a case-by-case decision, right? So in some cases, for example, right now they're doing in the early stages of a condor reintroduction closer to where I live up here in Southern Oregon. And the Yurok tribe is involved, and there's a lot of partners. And I think that in this case, I think this is a valuable and good effort. It is trying to get a bird back to where it was pre-colonization. And I think that everyone will be pretty excited if it works. But I don't think it's always the case that trying to wrestle an ecosystem or an animal species back in time is the right way to go. For example, some species have moved around and they've become very entrenched in their new habitats. And sometimes they get killed just because they're in the wrong place. But of course, they don't know they're not on the right continent or that they're invasive. And if they're not causing extinctions or threatening to cause extinctions, I find it more difficult to justify constantly killing them just because they're in the wrong place.
And the truth is, animals have always moved around to new environments.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, monkeys moved to South America 3 million years ago. And, and we don't say, well, we should remove all the monkeys from South America because they weren't originally there. I mean, there's no one moment in time that is perfectly correct according to science. Only sort of human cultural notions of when the baseline should be can exist. There is no scientific answer to that question.
Now, there are people, and I'm sure I'm going to hear from them after this interview airs, who get really upset and are really concerned about invasive species. Mm-hmm. And talking about invasive species, I was explaining Lake Merritt here in Oakland a moment ago. Again, the first wildlife refuge in North America, claimed in 1870. Not because they were trying to protect the animals, they were just trying to stop the hunting in what was becoming a city. But nonetheless, it's still lots of birds there throughout the year. But it's also it's full of invasive species from all over the world because Oakland is a major port. Many ships come in from Asia, gather in the ballast water underneath the ship, bring in over all kinds of different species. And it's really sort of a multicultural, or whatever you'd want to call it, experience when you look in the lake of all the aquatic life that is there. But at the same time, I guess there's a danger of when does an invasive, I guess there's a balance. When does an invasive species come and basically learn how to and is able to coexist with what's there? And when does it come and dominate the environment and change the environment in a way that is bad for other species that are already there?
Right. So some people will tell you that the term invasive species only applies to non-native species that cause problems, that there is a large group of non-native species and then only some of them are invasive. Now, it's also true that in common language, people use invasive species to refer to any non-native species all the time. So it's a distinction that some people preserve, but not everyone. Now, you'll notice, though, that the question of whether or not the non-native species causes harm is, again, not really a scientific question. It's a question of values, human values. So my plea with non-native species is essentially to just interrogate those value judgments carefully and to say to each other, is this species really causing a specific harm that we all agree we do not want? And in that case, I think that it can be justifiable to try to control them or remove them. What I object to is cases where animals and plants are being controlled and removed where there is no specific harm that it is causing other than taking up space that could be taken up by natives, right? So if you look through the records of conservation removals of plants, for example, as I've done, I looked through dozens and dozens and dozens of examples that are in a database called conservation evidence. The vast majority of them don't make any justification for why the non-native is removed other than it's non-native. And the ones that do often just say it was displacing the native species, which is basically it's taking up some space, right? Like it can't really exist in the ecosystem without displacing a native species at some level. So you can always say that. Now, if you look at the data, in fact, there are no examples of introduced species that we can say caused an extinction on continental North America. Like I challenge your listeners to find me one. That would be great. I'd love to have an example. There are certainly cases where non-native species have reduced the abundance of native species that we like. And in many cases, that might be enough of a justification to control them. We certainly don't want to have an extinction in the future. But there are also a lot of non-native species that just exist in the new ecosystem, and they aren't going to cause anybody to go extinct. And when we are throwing huge amounts of herbicide at those landscapes to kill those things, or we are poisoning them with poisons that take a week to kill them, trapping them in foothold traps, shooting them, I just don't think we can justify doing all those things purely on the basis that these plants and animals are not native. I'm just saying, ask questions first and then shoot. Show me the harm and then shoot.
Is there danger in trying to eliminate invasive species or trying to preserve or even bring back a previous species and playing a little bit of sort of the Frankenstein story? We're playing with something that we may not fully understand.
I don't know. I don't really love comparisons to the Frankenstein story because I do think that a lot of cases conservation interventions have worked, Yeah. Florida panther, we decided that we should move some Texas panthers over to save them. They were in a genetic bottleneck. We did. It worked. There's now panthers in Florida. Like 2 thumbs up. Like a lot of times when we do stuff to try to save species, it works. I'm sorry, the clouds are coming over the sun.
That's okay.
So a lot of times when we take action to save species that are threatened, it totally works. And you don't hear as much about those stories. You tend to hear about the ones that went awry, that we brought in this species to control this species, and then it became a menace. In fact, often these are not conservation actions that cause problems. They're often agricultural. They were brought in to control crop pests and the like. But there are examples. There was one on the Channel Islands where attempts to restore to an earlier ecosystem we can't always predict exactly how it's going to go. So I think the way that one worked is we had a bunch of invasive pigs. I'll have to look this up after our discussion. But there were a bunch of invasive pigs, and they were removed from the island. And then that meant that their predators, which included eagles, were now mostly going after the Channel Island foxes, which we wanted to preserve. So in order to save them, we then had to rush in and take the eagles away, at least temporarily. So sometimes things don't go quite as planned. But I think that it's still good to try to stop extinctions. On the other hand, wrestling with ecosystems, taking things out, putting things back in, just for the sake of historical accuracy, I think is not necessarily always the best idea. Apart from anything else, the climate is changing. And sometimes ecosystems are changing because they are adapting to new conditions. If you try to wrestle them back in time, you might actually be hindering their ability to stay resilient and robust in the future.
You mentioned
sometimes we need to learn from what nature is showing us rather than trying to squish nature back into the box that we think it fits in.
You mentioned earlier about coyotes being in more urban environments. We've seen an increase of coyotes during the pandemic in San Francisco.
Right. Or maybe they're just out more often.
Well, and it could be all kinds of things, right? Fire. I mean, I don't know exactly what causes it. Maybe they're out more often. Maybe there's just less people doing their daily work, whatever it is. But I think the pandemic has been sort of certainly an experience for us all. Has the pandemic informed your own writing or coverage or thinking about wildlife?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, in the very early days of the pandemic, when there were a lot fewer people out on the streets and out on the roads, you did see more animals out. And I think people liked that. People thought, hey, I think that when we can learn from that is that that it does not take a ton for us to create a more coexistent relationship with non-native species. Just small adjustments in our behavior can make room for other species, and they will take advantage of it very quickly. They're smart. They will figure out how to live in our world if we just give them a little bit of resources, a little bit of space. So I think that was encouraging. The other way that the pandemic informed my writing, I think, is that I actually wrote the book because I couldn't go anywhere. So I was in my shed in my backyard, and I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and got it done. So that was, for me, I felt very grateful that I had a stay-at-home project that was so meaningful to get through those days. The pandemic has hit everybody hard, and as somebody who lives in the West and has always been able to escape into the hills or into the mountains when I needed to get away from life, the phase of the pandemic when all the public lands were closed to recreation, I found extremely claustrophobic, and it made me realize how much I value those public lands and how important they are to my mental health. Even on days when I'm just at home, I know that if I wanted to, I could go to a wilderness area or a national forest. And that's a huge like escape valve for me. And it made me just really, really grateful that we have that resource, and make me also want there to be more public lands available for people on the East Coast who don't have that resource.
Other than having daily experiences with wildlife and being aware of it, deepening perhaps our daily existence of where we live, are there other consequences towards declining wildlife in the world for us that we may not be aware of?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, first of all, it pushes more of us to have our wildlife interactions via the David Attenborough documentaries, which I think adds a little bit of layer of separation between us and the non-human world that I don't think is great in the long term. I would like every kid to be able to see a deer, And in a lot of the country, a lot of North America, at least, that's something that most kids can see. And at least once a year, maybe they'll see a deer from the car, or it depends on where they live. But I think there's a sense in which this all comes back to the way that humans live with other species, and whether we live with them in a good relationship or whether we take more than is fair. I think at this point we're taking more than is fair, and the other animals on the planet that we share the earth with are just getting the short end of the stick. I think a lot of us realize that, but I also think that we have the technologies and we have the understanding about how to give back more and how to make more space for those other species. We can do it, even at our current population levels and even at higher population levels. So I do think that there's a huge appetite among many people to pull back in terms of what resource use, so that there's more for other species.
Tell me about space and how space could be used to increase even wildlife.
Yeah. So, there's different kind of ways in which there's different kinds of habitat that non-human animals can thrive in. Depending on your species, your backyard could, right, my backyard hosts skunks and lots of bird species and tons of insect species, and they're all perfectly happy there. They don't need Yosemite. However, for the bigger animals, they do need a big amount of space that isn't dense with people. So in order to protect and preserve all of the different animal species, you need a range of habitats that you are providing, all the way from the backyard up to the national park, and with tons of kinds of different graduated ideas in between. So for many years, for example, I was kind of obsessed with this question of whether agriculture should get more intensive so that it could be on a tiny, tiny footprint, and then we could give that spared land back to other species, or whether agriculture should become more messy and organic and use fewer chemicals so that more species could live on an individual farm. And then I realized, you don't have to choose. We can do both of them, right? We could have some farms that are extremely good for biodiversity and that have big pollinator plantings all around the crops, and that are using owls to kind of balance out the little rodents that might want to eat the crops and are very ecological. And we also might, down the road from that, have a big building that looks like Costco that's making from the outside, a big square box that's making protein that's not animals that we could eat. Your Impossible Burgers, your Beyond Burgers, that kind of stuff. And those two models can work together to massively shrink the footprint of agriculture, which remains the biggest user of land that humans use on planet Earth.
You said that you are an optimist. Do you see us getting to the point to where, I mean, people call this the sixth great extinction that we're going through right now, that we haven't had an extinction at this rate since the meteor that hit the world 60 million years ago wiped out the dinosaurs. Are you optimistic we get to a point where we sort of reverse that trend, slow that trend?
Yeah, I am. And I'll tell you, the sixth great extinction, like I understand why that rhetoric and why that tagline is so catchy to people, but I also feel like it is maybe unnecessarily scary because certainly the rate of extinctions that we've had for the last 100 years, if we continued it for another million years, would give us something like the dinosaurs, right? But we would have to keep driving other species extinct at the same rate or a higher rate, are actually a higher rate because many of those rate estimates are based on the premise that all threatened species will go extinct. We'd have to do that for a really long time in order for us to have that kind of extinction event, like at least thousands of years. And I just don't believe that human beings will be this bad at living with other species for that long. I just think we're going to get better at it. I just think we're going to stop. Our rate is going to come down quickly. That's where my optimism is. And if our rate does come down quickly, we don't have to have the sixth mass extinction. It is still preventable. We are just in the very first, like 2 human generations of this rate. Maybe a few more, but like we're at the very beginning of an extinction event, a mass extinction event. And if we stop driving other species extinct, it won't happen. It won't be in the history books, for in the far, far, far future. So saying that we're in this event, I think gives people the impression that it's like the horse is out of the barn. There's nothing we can do. It's over. The extinction is happening. It is preventable. We can stop it. And that part of the message, I think, really needs to get out there. Yes, our rate right now is unacceptable. But if you look at the IUCN Red List, we're still at something like since 1500, we have something like 900 documented extinctions. Way too many, right? But there's millions of species on the planet. So if we stop now, it won't be a mass extinction event.
That's interesting to me. I didn't realize the difference in scale.
Yeah, the scales are huge.
I mean, it probably speaks to how big of an extinction event it was, I guess, 60 million years ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, those extinction events were just bonkers. I mean, there weren't even whole huge numbers of bird species went extinct because there were literally no trees for them to perch on or nest in. I mean, we're talking about something that's we're not in dinosaur extinction land yet, and we can absolutely prevent it, 100%.
I guess that makes me feel a little better. I mean, I've worried when I see these reports about there being 3 billion less birds now than there was in, say, like 1970, which makes me wonder, when I'm older, if I'm lucky enough to become much older and as on my deathbed living in a world without birds.
Right, but again, those declines in abundance are the wake up call. But as long as those birds aren't extinct, their numbers can come back. If we rearrange our landscapes and we live differently on the planet, they will reproduce and we can get them back. Some of them, like your cranes who have 1 egg every other year, are going to take longer. Some of them, your little songbirds who have a clutch of 6 birds and can double clutch, we might be able to see those numbers come back much more quickly. But if we get our act together, we can get those billions of birds back. And it can happen so quickly that from the point of view of a biologist looking back 300 years from now, it'll be like the blink of an eye. And it's happened before. I mean, in this country, globally, Canada geese were down to some incredibly small number of individuals and were considered hyper endangered. And now they're everywhere, right? Now they're being shot by conservationists sometimes.
They're a nuisance now. I mean,
yeah, they're a nuisance now. The bison, we're down to something like 12 breeding individuals, and now we're back up to, 500,000 at least. So you can get them back if you do things right.
It makes me think of the DDT story and how pelicans and other large birds almost went extinct in the 1970s, 1960s, that period of time, until they banned DDT. And now, if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, if you're on the bay in the summer, there are just thousands and thousands of big brown pelicans. It's pretty wonderful and pretty hopeful, I guess.
And we need to tell these stories, and we need to know these stories, and we need to talk about the possibilities, the good possibilities, because I have gone through periods where, climate change, species extinction crisis, where I have felt that things are hopeless. And when you get to that hopeless place, you don't do anything to try to make things better. So that's why I believe that it's really important to try to envision and understand that there's a realistically possible good future up for grabs that we could have if we do the right stuff and if we push for the right policies and if we make the right changes. And I do believe that it's the sort of big top level policies that are going to be more effective than individual behaviors. Although those are awesome to do too, creating a wildlife sanctuary in your backyard, awesome. Shrinking your carbon footprint, awesome. I still think it's the big political stuff at the high end that's going to really turn things around.
Even with climate change, you think this is possible?
Yeah, so I focus my own, the sort of piece of my energy that I give to trying to stop and reverse climate change. I do that. I think it's more effective to be in a collective group. I'm part of a group called Rogue Climate here in Southern Oregon. That's a climate justice group that just recently, for example, helped craft and pass a sweeping law that's going to says that all Oregon's electricity has to be renewable by 2035. And so that is just massively more effective for me than trying to lower my own individual footprint at home. I'm trying to make these big changes at the top level. And so I haven't bought an electric car yet. I put solar panels on my house. I haven't bought the electric car yet because I haven't had the money. But I don't feel guilty driving to the Rogue Climate Board meeting in my gas car because I know that I'm a drop in the bucket. I can use my energy and my focus to change the big systems. That's going to be more effective in the long run. And guilt is not good for anybody anyway. Just try to leave that guilt to the side. That, if you're emitting more than you wanted, it's probably because you live inside a system that wants you to emit, so you'll funnel profits to the fossil fuel companies. So don't feel like a jerk. Feel pissed off.
Emma Marris is an award-winning environmental and science journalist. She is the author of the book that we've been in conversation about called Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. Emma Marris, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you greatly for taking this time to talk to me today.
Sure. It was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.